Hello to all! Welcome back to our stroll down the revolutions of Latin America, where we dissect the details of the conflicts of the continent. Today, we find ourselves in the depths of Brazil in the beginnings of the 19th century. I'll pass it on to my correspondent Cindy. Take it away!
Thanks, Izzy, for the intro. Now you all must be wondering how this whole thing started. Let me give you all a brief rundown. So in Europe, the Peninsular Wars had been in full swing since 1807. This war was basically a military conflict of the Napoleonic Wars, wherein the nations of Spain, the United Kingdom, and Portugal were all in deep conflict with France. So in 1808, the Portuguese court fled to one of their colonies, Brazil, in the city of Rio de Janeiro. By 1815, the end of the war left the British with a significant control of Portugal, and it sparked a national revolution in 1820. In 1821, they created a new constitution and forced King João to return to Portugal, leaving his elder son, Dom Pedro, as the regent of Brazil. By September 7th of 1822, the next year, the prince officially declared Brazil's intentions of independence, leading to a 2-year war against Portugal, and finally, in 1825, Portugal and Brazil signed a treaty making it official. Brazil was now an independent nation. So that was pretty much a quick rundown of the situation, but Brazilian independence couldn't have happened without some key individuals. I already briefly mentioned them previously, but let's go more in depth. So, like I mentioned previously, King Dom João really started this whole ordeal. He and the rest of his family, alongside various noble families, fled Portugal in 1807 after Napoleon invaded, and arrived in Rio de Janeiro March 1808. While in Brazil, he made Brazil sort of co-equal with Portugal. He established various royal institutions and educational facilities, and basically made it so that Brazilian colonies were no longer really the colonies, but instead on the same level as Portugal. So this really started the conflict between the Brazilians and the Portuguese, because now the Brazilians had sort of this identity that was separate from Portugal, and they had a lot of pride in that. After Napoleon's occupation of Portugal ended, King Dom João was forced to return to Portugal, so he left his son Dom Pedro behind to rule. So, Dom Pedro was really a huge figure in all this. He came into power during a tumultuous time where the antagonism between the Brazilians and the Portuguese was really starting to get bad. The Cortes, or the Parliament of Lisbon back in Portugal, sought to repeal most of those reforms I talked about previously that made Brazil sort of co-equal to Portugal. They really wanted to return Brazil back to its colonial status. So the Cortes also ordered Dom Pedro to return to Portugal as well, so that they could prevent him from instigating an independence movement. And you probably already know where this is going. In his famous speech called Fico, he declared that he was staying in Brazil and defied the Cortes' orders. And by January 1822, independence talks really were starting. Dom Pedro appointed his advisor, José Bonifacio de Andrada e Silva, the head of the ministry dedicated to discussing Brazil's independence, and he's a really important guy. Andrada would later be known as the Patriarch of Independence because his role was really vital in securing their independence. On September 7th, when Dom Pedro declared this independence, he became the Prime Minister of the Brazilian Empire, alongside Dom Pedro, who was crowned the Emperor on December 1st.
Thanks, Cindy, for that great explanation of all the important people. Here are some turning points in the Brazilian War for Independence. During late 1821 and early 22, the inhabitants of Brazil took sides in the political upheavals that took place in Rio de Janeiro and Lisbon. This eventually led to a war which lasted for 2 years. The Portuguese military had split into supporters of Portugal and Brazilian independence. Eventually, supporters of Brazilian independence created the Brazilian Army and Navy. There was a large number of former Portuguese, but the Brazilians were suspicious of their loyalty. So British officers were recruited to fight with the Brazilians because they knew they were most likely against Portugal. While Portuguese supporting forces stopped rebels in certain cities, including Salvador, Montevideo, and São Luís, they couldn't defeat militias in most of the cities or the guerrilla forces in rural locations. There were not a ton of battles, mostly because this war was relatively pretty short. Brazil and Portugal signed the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro in 1825 to formally recognize Brazil's independence. Now we are examining an image of the Brazilian War for Independence. It was painted in 1888 by Pedro Américo, and it is called Independence or Death. As we learned previously, Prince Pedro declared Brazil's independence in September 1822. Many people rallied around him, especially Creoles, who were people of Spanish descent born in Latin America. Some people can be seen taking off blue and white armbands that represent Portuguese loyalty. Here's our second image. This was produced by Benedito Calixto. Its name can be translated to the Proclamation of the Republic. The buildings in the background look big, and they would only be found in a city. This makes sense because this proclamation was made in Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital of the Empire of Brazil. A group of military officers of the Brazilian army staged a coup d'etat without the use of significant violence and brought the Creoles to power in Brazil. Most of the government structure did not change except for who was in power. Now let's go to Cindy for an investigation of a key document.
After taking a closer look at a couple key images, let's go over the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro of 1825. Now, this document was incredibly vital because it basically marked the official independence of Brazil. While Brazil declared its independence September of 1822, it wasn't until 1825 that Portugal actually recognized Brazil as an independent nation, and this was following a series of military conflicts. It was signed in Rio de Janeiro, as the name suggests, on August 29th of 1825. This marked the end of Brazil's struggle for independence. It was previously ratified by Brazil on August 24th of 1825, and then after the signing, Portugal ratified it November 15th, 1825. So within the document are 11 articles, and they basically outline Brazil's independence and reestablish international relations with Portugal. For example, Article 10 states, trade relations between both Portuguese and Brazilian nations will be restored from the outset, with all commodities repaying 15% of consumer rights provisionally, with the duties of re-exporting are the same as that practiced before the separation. So the United Kingdom mediated the signing of this treaty because they had already informally recognized Brazil's independence prior to this signing. They also had a couple ulterior motives involving trade. They would later also sign a treaty with Brazil. So that wraps up all I have for our key documents portion of the podcast. Now I'll turn over the mic to Izzy.
Thanks, Cindy. Now, this happy period of independence wouldn't last, unfortunately. Eventually, Pedro I was forced to abdicate in 1831 for political incompatibilities, which basically meant that elites saw him as too liberal, while intellectuals saw him as not liberal enough. He left for Portugal, leaving his then 5-year-old son Pedro II as emperor, though sure would be some tough shoes to fill. Luckily, or rather unluckily, the country was left in the rule of regents for the next 9 years, during which there was constant rebellion and general political instability. Finally, Pedro II was seen fit to rule and managed to maintain economic and social stability for much of his rule of over 58 years. Unfortunately for him, the combined effort of the military and the people led to a civil-military coup. On the surface, it seems strange since his rule turned Brazil into an emerging international power. However, throughout much of his rule, there was a growing resentment from the middle-class, military, and coffee planters of the widening gap between themselves and the elite. To them, Brazil's political system was still largely monarchical, and they wanted something closer to a republic. At the same time, Pedro II had had a very weak response to the abolition of slavery. While he supported it, he was also afraid of angering slave owners. Slavery was abolished in 1888, but in November of 1889, Pedro II was forced to abdicate his throne and fled to Europe in exile. The collapse of both slavery and the monarchy led to the first Brazilian republic with a completely new constitution, which would last until the Brazilian Revolution of 1930 or another military coup. Nevertheless, both Pedro I and his son have undoubtedly left a mark on the nation, in both Brazil's independence from Portugal and its first steps into the international playing field. And that is the story of Brazil's valiant battle for independence from Portugal. Tune in next week for a rundown of the next nation.